For more than a century, African American Presbyterians in Western North Carolina were part of an important organization that nurtured and supported their faith. That was Catawba Presbytery. I'm Reverend Dr. Jerry Lytle Cannon. I was the last pastor ordained by the Catawba Presbytery on December the 28th, 1988. My late sister, the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, was the first African American woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church. And that happened in Catawba Presbytery too. My mother, Corrine Lytle Cannon, was one of his most faithful volunteers. My entire family attended church in the Catawba Presbytery. Now, this isn't really the story of my family. It's about the generations of families whose education, faith, and even their working lives were shaped by Catawba Presbytery. Catawba offered opportunities not available to us anywhere else.
One of the legacies of Catawba Presbytery was that it remained intact as a presbytery for 122 years. From its founding as the first all-black presbytery in the Presbyterian Church. And of course, when it was founded, Catawba Presbytery really covered all of North Carolina, I think all the way down to Georgia. But from October 6, 1866 to December 31st, 1988, it remained intact. And I think that's something of a legacy.
Well, first I think it was God's design for us. It was one of the largest presbyteries that we had from between here and California. Most everybody I've ever met was proud to be a part of it. We worked together.
Catawba was a place where we had a voice. African Americans were the leaders. We were committee chairs, we were moderators, and many of us became pastors.
You see the legacy of Catawba in those of us who are still here, who were a part of Catawba.
To understand how important and unusual Catawba Presbytery was, you need to know its history. Western North Carolina was covered in cotton fields attached to large plantations. Enslaved Africans freed following the Civil War left plantations with only the clothes on their backs. They had to begin their new lives without the benefit of an education, without a dime to their name, without property. And while they would be tolerated in their former masters' churches, it would be only under restricted conditions and inferior status. This was not acceptable. Former enslaved people needed entirely new systems to support their lives.
Very little was done by states to educate children. Some states didn't do much to educate even white children. And they certainly didn't have an interest in educating black children for a number of reasons. One was to really maintain a kind of dependency, and so that people would not get beyond a certain level of knowledge. So they would have to pretty much continue doing menial work and agricultural work. Charlotte did not have schools for black children. So the initial efforts at education really belonged to the churches.
3 ordained Presbyterian men stepped in to help. Those 3 pastors, Reverend Samuel C. Alexander, Reverend Willis Miller, and Reverend Sidney Merklin, were white. They were disillusioned with treatment of African Americans by leaders of Presbyterian churches in their region. These men were called by God to serve former enslaved persons. The Presbyterian Church had split in 1861 over the issue of slavery, creating 2 separate denominations. So they received commissions from the Presbyterian Church USA, also known as the Northern Church. Catawba Presbytery held its first meeting on October the 6th, 1866 at Bethany Church in Iredell County, North Carolina. Catawba Presbytery was attached to the Synod of Baltimore. The Presbytery continued to grow and had 49 churches by 1927. The Presbytery was powered by volunteers who took on vital roles.
That's one thing I did like about the Presbyterian Church. They believed in education. You were not given, asked to take a position without training. And we were, they'd workshop you to death because they were preparing you to be a leader.
Education was key for the Catawba Presbytery, and there are important institutions that still exist today that got their start in the Presbytery.
We had two schools here, Biddle Institute, which is now Johnson C. Smith, and Barber Scotia College. Their focus initially was to provide really rudimentary education for those who were coming out of slavery. But the focus was to prepare people to become preachers and teachers. You needed to educate people so they could function in society. The preacher part of it had to do with the assumption that the church was essential and the Christian faith was essential for the well-being of people.
Johnson C. Smith Seminary moved to Atlanta to be part of another theological education consortium. The seminary remains the only historically black seminary that is part of the PCUSA and offers theological education courses online. The Northern and Southern churches reunited to form the Presbyterian Church USA that we know today. That merger happened in 1983, but it was a careful, extended process to bring Catawba into today's Presbyterian Church. The Catawba Presbytery continued until December 31st, 1988.
Presbyterians were given 6 years to work out new arrangements because there were a number of decisions that had to be made. You had to reshape boundaries, you had to decide which presbyterians were going to join which ones. And of course, in all of these instances, the question is, what's going to be the relationship between the formerly black Presbyterians and the formerly all-white Presbyterians? There were some people who were never satisfied with it because they hated to lose the identity of being Catawba Presbyterian. It was fraught with tensions, but we finally brought it about. There was also the whole theological notion of the unity of the church, which was a big issue pushing reunion. How can we proclaim reconciliation to the world when we can't even get together ourselves?
Admittedly, it was sad for those who were part of Catawba Presbytery to join a much larger organization in which their voices would be a minority. They had understandable questions. The authors of Periscope magazine wrote in 1982, one of the stated reasons for reunion is that it offers a mandate to provide for full participation and representation of minorities in the life and leadership of the church. At least two questions were raised by this statement. How will reunion provide for the fuller participation and representation of minorities in the life and leadership of the church? And when? Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon wrote about reunion in Periscope 2, published in 1982. This publication was the second of two that explored 175 years of African American Presbyterianism. Here's what she had to say. Reunion will provide more flexibility and placement for seminarians and indeed for all of us. Although I have apprehensions about specific aspects of the plan, I again affirm reunion, for it will provide a greater unity and mission with our black colleagues in the PCUS. Voices, including Katie's, were important to passing the vote in favor of reunion.
Anytime you make a change that drastic, you bother. You have to think about what you're leaving behind. We had pleasant memories for Catawba. In other words, we did it our own way. and it was a very powerful. At all the Presbyterian churches that I remember used to have those wonderful Sunday school conventions and things. Everybody felt a part of it. Then after it was integrated, and you don't hold back progress.
You can see the influence of Catawba throughout Charlotte and the Presbyterian Church USA still today. There are pastors who were raised in Catawba Presbytery churches who are serving throughout the denomination and far beyond.
Just the history of the leadership that came out of Johnson C. Smith and Barbara Scotia College. It's the PCUSA. It really is. In fact, I just once for fun wrote down who I consider to be the most powerful people in the Presbyterian Church USA right now. And the great majority of them are African American men and women who were impacted by, they either went to Johnson C. Smith or Barbara Scotia or impacted by those things. Catawba Presbytery's story is one of the richest stories in our whole denomination and certainly in our presbytery. And so those are stories that we don't want to lose. We want to keep telling them.
Knowing the story of Catawba Presbytery is to better understand the Presbyterian Church USA. It helps each of us understand each other and approach the relationships in our connectional church with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love. May we continue to grow together as a family of God.